Conceptual models of policy making. What would an ideal policy look like? What is the best policy design that can be achieved? Both questions are crucial to policy making. The first one refers to the functionality of a policy to be formulated, which design a particular policy should have in order to meet an ex-ante defined goal. The second one touches upon the constraints that appear which policies are actually made. These are principally given by politics, that process by which the actors involved make decisions. Therefore, it is essential for our purpose to examine how politics shapes policies. There are a number of conceptual models that help to clarify our understanding of the relationship between the politics and the policies. The major models that can be found in the literature are first, the institutional model, second, the rational model, third, incremental model, fourth, the group model, and the fifth, elite model, and the last six is the process model. These models are not competitive but rather complementary as they focus on different aspects of political life. Adherents concentrate on separate characteristics of policies. Dye 2005. The main implication of these models is that they make different assumptions about the importance of the actors involved: institutions, politicians, bureaucrats, interest groups, and the public and their rationality. If we conceive of policymakers as entirely rational actors that search for maximizing solution to policy problems, our analytic focus would rather be on the quality of available information, decision procedures, and etc. If we, however, mood policymakers as imperfectly rational actors, the research interest should rather shift to the role of other aspects, such as mechanism of finding compromises. We now shortly explain these models, except the process model, which we address in the next section, to provide an initial theoretical access to policy making. Rational model. First developed in the field of economic analysis, the rational model of decision-making formulates guidance on how to secure optimal policy decision, implying that no other alternative is better according to the decision-maker's preferences. Shopsy and Bonjik, 1997. The rational model is also associated with a particular model of learning, namely the concept of Bayesian learning. According to this perspective, government update their beliefs on the consequences of policy with all available information about policy outcomes in the past and elsewhere and choose the policy that is expected to yield the best results. And Messinguer-Yebra, 2009. Rational policymaking involves a number of demanding assumptions. For example, policymakers are expected to have perfect information, which has provoked strong criticism. Simon, 1955-1957. Despite the central appointment of criticism, the rational model remains important for analytical purpose as it helps to contrast ideal policy decisions with the actual ones. By assuming that all political actors behave rationally, reduces costs and maximize benefits, it also provides the starting point for public choices approaches to policy making. Public choice theory examines the logic and foundation of action of individuals and groups that are involved in the policy-making process. In this regard, the main object of analysis are voting behavior and party competitions, qualifications, and government formations. The 7 involvement of interest groups and bureaucracy in policy-making. See Muller, 2003 for an overview. Along the same lines, the rational model is related to game theory, which serves for analyzing decisions in situations in which 2 or more rational players interact, and where the outcome depends on the choices made by each. C.F. McCarthy and Meirowitz, 2007. Since game theory allows for systematically modeling the interactions of policy actors, It represents an instructive way of examining the outcomes of policy making in areas that are affected by externalities such as trade or environmental policy. See Lustig et al. 2003, Mitchell and 2009.
Institutional model for a long time. The central interest of political science was on how institutional arrangements influence the content of policies. The analytical focus on the institutional model is hence primarily on the balance between executives and legislative, which show notable variation across political systems. From the institutional perspective, policies are formulated and implemented exclusively by these institutions. In consequence, policymaking is a smooth and largely technical process in which all relevant institutions participate. All the institutional process, however, remain a black box.
Incremental model. Incrementalism emerged as a response to the rational model. Rather than an ideal, it purports to be a realistic description of how policymakers arrive at their decisions. This is related to its foundation on bounded rationality, an alternative concept to rational choice that takes into account the limitation of both knowledge and cognitive capacities of decision makers. Generally, incremental decisions involve limited changes to existing policies. Similar to rational learning, there is also a concept of bounded learning. In that case, governments likewise engage in information gathering activity but do not scan all available experiences. Instead, they use analytical shortcuts and cognitive heuristics to process the information. An example of such heuristic is the adoption of policies from countries that are considered to be particularly successful. The Achilles heel of the incremental model is that it does not explain how decision makers arrive at this incremental adjustment. Characterized by stability and incrementalism, but occasionally produce large-scale departures from the past. By employing data in government processes in the United States, Belgium, and Denmark, show that incrementalism is an empirical reality.
Group model. Group theory hypothesis that policies are the result of an equilibrium reached in group struggle, which is determined by the relative strength of each interest group. Groups can be distinguished concerning several aspects such as income, membership size, membership density and recruitment, organizational aspects, sanctioning mechanism, and aspects of leadership. Consequently, changes in the relative strength of the individual interest groups involved may trigger policy change. More generally, group theory presupposes that policymakers are constantly responding to group pressures, which motivates politicians to form majority coalitions for which they have the competence to define what groups are to be included. The potential effect of groups for policymaking depends on the particular politician structures in corporatist system. For instance, economic interests are strongly integrated in policymaking arena. The fragmentation of the marketplace, a competitive process for determining policies, and the neutrality of government. Elite model. Related to the group theory is the view that policymaking is determined by the preferences of governing elite. The elite model is more specific in a sense as it claims that electorate is generally poorly informed about policies and that the elite public opinion on policy question. In this way, the elite model mainly highlights the potential source of bias in policymaking in alternatives the adoption of policy alternatives that rather corresponds to the preferences of the elite than of the general public. This view, however, contradict the popular median voter theory, which convey that under the condition that simple majority rule is used, opinion held by the median voter will become a policy decision.
Analyzing policymaking as a process. The policy cycle. What are the main characteristics of policymaking? Basically, three features can be identified. First, policymaking occurs in the presence of multiple constraints, shortage of time and resources, public opinion, and of course, the Constitution. Secondly, policymaking involves the existence of various policy progress. Governments are not unitary actors but consistent of different departments that overlap and compete with each other. Thirdly, these policy processes form an infinite cycle of decision and policies. Current policy decisions are not independent of decisions taken before, and policies under discussion today may have knock-on effects leading to further policies tomorrow. Newton and Van Dett 2010, given this characteristic, is convenient to conceive of policymaking as a process model, which is also often labeled policy cycle. Laswell 1956, it models the policy process as a series of political activities consisting of 1. Agenda setting, 2. Policy formulation, 3. Policy adoption, 4. Implementation, and lastly, evaluation. Each policy cycle begins with the identification of a societal problem and its placement on the policy agenda. Subsequently, policy proposals are formulated, from which one will be adopted. In the next stage, the adopted policy is taken to action. Finally, the impact of the policy are evaluated. This last stage leads straight back to the first, indicating that the policy cycle is continuous and unending. This sequential model of the policy cycle represents a simplification in the real world. Different political actors and institutions may simultaneously be involved in single process, yet the policy cycle provides a useful heuristic for breaking policymaking into different units to illustrate how policies are actually made.